Welcome to I Like Beer, the book club, where we discuss great books while drinking great beer. I'm your host, Jeff Spanier. With me, the co-host of I Like Beer, the podcast, Jeff Riccitelli.
Happy to be here.
Our book and beer friend, author Ryan Woldt.
Hey, everybody.
So Jeff and I bonded years ago over a fondness for craft beer and telling stories, and we met Ryan through our love of beer, and then we quickly learned that we shared another passion, a love of reading. And out of this, we give you I Like Beer, the book club, where once a month we will join our, you laughed at me last time for this, but our intellectual literary powers.
I was already laughing this time.
That's why I play the host. So you guys are the intellectual powers. I'm the host. To discuss a book, share a beer, rotating the host based on who has chosen the book. And tonight, that's Jeff. And the book is J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. But before we turn the first page, let's find out what we're drinking and why. Jeff, what do you got?
I've got, it's Founders Frangelic Mountain Brown, which is a brown ale brewed with hazelnut coffee. And I'm not a big coffee guy, unlike some of the other people on this show here tonight. But I actually really, it's a good beer. It's got a really great kind of chocolate taste, and then you get a little of the hazelnut on the back end of it. And I picked it because it's got the mountains in there, and I fear we're talking a little bit about some Appalachia. So maybe it was a little bit appropriate.
Very good. And Ryan, before you tell us about the beer, I got to tell you, I'm loving Roast West Coast.
Oh, thank you very much. The new coffee podcast has been going really well, and there's so much coffee in my house right now. So if I start talking
COVID
real fast,
so I can come over and have a cup of coffee with you. And thank you for validating my love of slurping coffee.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's
my
how
dad
you get
used
all
to
the
slurp
flavors.
the coffee, and my mom would complain, and he'd say, "That's how you're supposed to drink coffee." And of course, I thought that was absurd, but there's nothing like slurping coffee, and you explained it all.
That's right. That's how you spread that flavor around in your mouth, so it hits the right temperature and it hits all the different pleasure centers of the mouth, let's call them, and it's the only way to really enjoy it. And that way, everyone else knows how much you're enjoying it too, so they'll get excited about it. For beer, though, I thought about going with an Appalachia outdoor mountainy, theme. I even bought some Montucky cold snacks, Tall Boys, which are in the fridge, but I decided not to go with that tonight. With the new lockdown in California in place, I wanted to support a local brewery, and so Virgin Brewing, which is right down the street from me, long ways down the street, but down the street nonetheless. They started doing delivery again, and free delivery for the $50 order, which was real easy to hit. So I have their Kelvin Strong Pale Ale, which is a beer they make every year. And on top of, supporting local, they actually donate $1 for every single can of this they sell to a local ALS charity in honor of one of their friends who passed away. So I wanted to do that. Just shutdown rules are in place. Everything's closed. Right. So I wanted to get a beer delivery. And honestly, I ordered it last night at 8 o'clock, 8:30. And I got a text from Chris from the brewery there. And he said, I left it on your porch, and it was, like 10 o'clock this morning. So they're on top of it.
Very cool.
Excellent. And you want to shout out some of your other projects?
I certainly can. Right now, I've got the Roast West Coast podcast. So if you're listening to this, look for that. That's it's all about coffee. We interview coffee roasters. We learn about coffee. And then I've got it's the holiday season. I'm trying to sell books, Jeff. I got my book, Eli and Jane, is out there. I've got 23 copies left in my house that I decided I got to sell over the next couple of weeks. So if you're looking for a book to read, or you are looking for a gift, a book and a bag of coffee or a 6-pack of beer, Eli and Jane, you can find it on Amazon. You can order it from my website, One Wildlife Co. And I'm sure we'll put a link in the show's notes.
Sounds like the perfect gift to me.
Yep.
Coffee and book, or a beer and a book.
It's a good read. Good read, too. An enjoyable read.
I was excited to hear the progress you're making
with
the continuation of the story. So excited to hear that. Thank you for sharing some of that with me.
Yeah, I'm about 30,000 plus words into the sequel, and I haven't decided how far it's going to go, or if I'm just going to run them off a cliff and call it a day.
Thelma and Louise it.
It depends on how frustrated I am on any given day.
All right. Well,
And what are you
how,
drinking, Jeff?
Yeah, you didn't say what you were drinking.
Oh, I've got. I also went local with Culver Beer Company, friends of ours, former Carlsbad High alums as well. Mad Neighbor American Blonde Ale, and I thought that seemed apropos for tonight's segment, Mad Neighbor. And I like the double meaning in mad, that it's angry and a little crazy. And after reading this book, I realized some of our fellow citizens, some of our neighbors are just that.
Yeah.
A little angry and a little crazy.
It took this book for you to realize that?
Well, actually, that's something I want to get to as we get into our talk here. If you're looking for more of Jeff and Jeff, you can find us on I Like Beer, the podcast. Anywhere you get your podcasts, check out our website, ilikebeerthepodcast.com. And you can find us on Instagram and Facebook, easy enough. Talent, you get to introduce the book.
All right. So this is called Hillbilly Elegy. Actually, the full title is Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis. And it is a memoir that was written by J.D. Vance and was published in 2016 originally. And he wrote this about what it says here, the Appalachian values of his Kentucky family and the relation to the social problems of his hometown of Middletown, Ohio, which is where his grandparents or his mother's parents moved when they were young. And so really it's just a memoir of his life. He's actually not that old really to be writing a memoir, because he's definitely younger than us. But he did write about that. And I think he brings up some interesting points. I know for me, this is the second time I read it. I actually read it when it first came out, and it was really interesting reading it here 4+ years later with the way our country has changed. I think actually it's a different read this time than it was even the first time, just because of it gives some perspective to things and how, maybe understanding some things. So I found that really interesting about it. And I think, it's for me personally, one of the biggest reasons I was drawn to it initially and kind of compelled to read it is it's something that is so foreign to me as someone who's born and grown up in Southern California, and pretty much that's my life, Southern California. So to read, I'm always interested to read about other parts of the United States, and it's really interesting to me when you read about an area where really it's almost like as if you're reading about another country. I mean, it's an interesting perspective, and to get a little taste or better understanding really of a different culture in a different area in our country.
He gave us an insight into the bubble that the hillbilly culture lives in, and of course we're reading it from the bubble of coastal Southern California, which is a wonderful bubble, but it is a bubble.
Yeah,
it did seem like
I would argue that he doesn't actually give us the perspective from the bubble of hillbilly Appalachia. He gives us the perspective of someone who lives near there.
Right.
And,
good point.
Isn't actually part of that bubble.
Because it is a 3-for-1. There's his story, his survival of obstacles, his forging his own way out, or at least his own way to live his life. Then there's the story of the family history, which is part of that bubble. But you're right. He's
been removed.
He's the product of it. And then there's the cultural story as well. And you read it, Talent. You read it right about the time of the 2016 election and reread it at the 2020 election. So I'm wondering if that gave you some insights to when we look at, I know for me, for the cultural part, when I wonder how does a Mitch McConnell, how does a Rand Paul get elected year after year after, this gave me some real insights on exactly how that happens.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it gives you some perspective, because I think a lot of us, as you called it, the Southern California bubble, sometimes we look at some of these people and we go, how can they think that, or why do they believe that? I think this lended, like I said, it gave you some perspective or some ideas as to, okay, I get that. I thought it was interesting in the book, and maybe later we'll get to that part, but kind of talk about how they moved from being with his grandfather and them, that they were Democrats. I mean, it was that they were the party, and then how that's evolved. It's kind of done a complete 180. And I found that was very interesting. One of the other things I thought was really, and I didn't even see it the first time I read it, but this time it like jumped out at me, was he was talking about fake news before I'd ever even heard about fake news, because there was a whole thing where he started talking about how people don't trust the media and don't believe, what they're hearing, what they're getting, and everything else. And I'm sure at the first time I read that, I just kind of read through those pages, but this time I was like, oh my gosh, he was talking about something that has become a central part of our everything, of our media. You turn on any television station or read a newspaper or, go on the internet as far as any pages, and all you're going to see is stuff about media bias. So that was kind of interesting.
And it wasn't even that they discount what we consider news media. It's not a part of their lives.
Yeah.
The distrust is so deep that they don't look at it and say, I doubt this. They've never looked at it, whether it's reading something or watching something. I got a question I'm going to start with Ryan on this. Did you ever get comfortable with the term hillbilly as you're reading the book?
I never had a problem with it.
Really? Okay.
I actually asked my wife about this because that was a pretty common term when I was growing up. And my wife said that she would have considered it a slur. Although I thought in my experience growing up, I think that term was used more affectionately. So just to kind of cards on the table, I do not like this guy. I don't like him from reading the book. I knew nothing about it before I started. I hadn't heard of it when it came out. I had no information about it. And I related quite a bit to a lot of the things he described in the beginning. And in retrospect, we had fairly similar upbringings. But that term hillbilly, as you asked, that was a term that was around where I lived in the Midwest. I think the word hick would be maybe more even affectionate than hillbilly, but I never really heard it referenced as a negative or as a slur at that time. And it just wouldn't have registered to me. It was something that was said in country music songs or something you'd say to your friend who wore overalls to school or whatever. And I think I have to say this now to get it out because it's going to color everything I say the rest of the show, which is I don't think J.D. Vance has ever been a hillbilly. I think he's kind of a poser. I even wrote he isn't a hillbilly on page 37. He grew up in the Midwest, and he had family who was from Appalachia, and he went to visit them in the summers. And I went to visit my cousins who lived on a farm in the summers, but I'm not a farmer.
Okay.
So I think he saw that, and growing up with his grandparents who had grown up with that, and he gets into a story in the beginning about his ancestors in the Hatfields and McCoys, clan, and the Blantons, which made me wonder if they're related to the Whiskey clan. It read to me like he heard all those stories growing up, and he saw his cousins and his uncles a couple weeks a year and had this romanticized notion of it. But he grew up in what is pretty much considered very normal middle America experience, and he wanted to somehow romanticize his own normal experience, which he wasn't having. And so he's applied those stories to his own life and figured out a way to connect them kind of down the chain. And where he grew up in Middletown, Ohio is actually a suburb of Cincinnati. It's a relatively big community. And it was even named the All-American City at one point in the 1950s. So I didn't know any of that as I was reading the book. This was all from research afterwards. But reading the book through the first 100 pages, I just kept thinking, well, I recognize this is all my own Midwestern childhood. And I wrote somewhere along, I think around page 100, that this feels just like a kid who's looking for someone to love him. He doesn't feel like he's getting that attention or that love that he might need. And then spent the whole second half of the book trying to figure out why he was blaming all these poor people in Appalachia for their own problems, and kind of creating this humble hero bootstrap story for himself, which what he had done growing up, even as a normal kid growing up and joining the Marines and going to college and getting into Yale, those are all accomplishments in their own right, but it kind of felt like he didn't feel that way. And so he wanted to extend or
a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, like he felt like he wanted to make that a bigger story.
And he's in the validation
behind it.
Yeah, he's looking for like validation of his accomplishments in some ways with those, those types of,
And, just kind of like I didn't catch it on the first read because it reads really fast. He's a good writer. There's no question, I thought. But the timeline of things was he really glosses over, he references, but he implies that he was around for some of these things that really happened in the decades before he was even born. You know, his hard drinking, hard living, violent grandfather had been sober for, you know, a couple of years before he was even born. You know, he grew up in that kind of more structured environment that maybe wasn't around in his family before he was born.
And he makes some fair reference that his mother is the real damaged goods of the situation, because she did grow up at that time. So
and she suffered from problems that he then suffered from. You know, her addiction problems certainly would have been more than enough for anyone, I think, to say that they had some struggles growing up, and living with an addict or being around an addict can be very difficult, obviously, and more than difficult. That's not even the right word. It's all encompassing.
Yeah.
But this story wasn't so much about that.
He did seem to, I felt, blur the lines when he got to his own story. I felt when he's talking about the culture, which I know nothing of, this was my, well, I don't want to say I don't know nothing of it, because authors have been trying to tell us about this culture for an awful long time. To Kill a Mockingbird, you know, the pride of the Cunninghams and the Yules and Huckleberry Finn, Pap Finn. You know, we've seen this culture revealed to us in literature for quite some time. But I've thought that his way of explaining that sort of a double-edged sword of pride made sense to me. These are people that need help but won't accept help. These are people that don't trust anyone outside of their group, and therefore, and desperately need outsiders to give them some guidance, if nothing else, and won't accept help, charity. I did appreciate some of the cultural, right? I can see what I do. I'm thinking back on the book about Vance's his recollection and his way of just presenting his story. I can see where you're coming from on that. I think that's a fair wrap.
Well, it reminded me of another book from a few years back, A Million Little Pieces by James Frey, which was also a memoir. Mm-hmm. And it came out later that maybe some of those experiences he lifted from people around him. It didn't really take away for me. I read it knowing that he had taken some of those stories and applied them to his own life, but it doesn't necessarily take away from the experience of growing up in Appalachia or living a hillbilly lifestyle. He's just not terribly upfront about his own, what feels like his own upbringing, in my opinion. And in that case, and with that book back then, that was a fantastic book. I loved reading that book, but I can see why people were really upset when they found out not all the stories were his, because they applied them to him, and, you know, and he accepted that application and said to it. Well, you just mentioned pride. And I think that, sorry to interrupt you, but that, I think that really is a strong point about, Appalachia, about Midwestern, really about working class cultures everywhere. And especially is something that we're really seeing right now is a large group of America is either in a position where they should be, or they're being forced to ask for help. And it may be the first time they've ever had to do that.
Yeah. There's this illusion of self-reliance that he claims or exposes, depending on how much you're going to trust your author. But that twists into a laying of blame. And he talks about, you know, when Bush is the president, you lay blame on Bush. When Obama is the president, it's even easier because he's more of an outsider than Bush. And the more the outsiders are different than them, the easier it is to lay blame and pretend like you're self-reliant. But what he exposes is a family and perhaps a culture that is not self-reliant. It's not working.
So right now, I know a lot of people have been struggling or losing their jobs through the pandemic, obviously the time that we're in, and asking for help for things like food. I think there's this connotation of like, well, food stamps means that you're poor, you can't help yourself. But there isn't always an answer, a common sense, like just go and work hard answer to problems like a pandemic. There just isn't. And it can be difficult for someone who's worked their whole life or has a strong work ethic to say, maybe I can't do this alone. And to me, that speaks less to say specifically a hillbilly culture or but more to maybe masculinity to some extent, and the lessons that we teach men about asking for help or being strong, or even sharing that they're afraid and need help, or all of those different things are things that I think a lot of people may be confronting for the first time. The pandemic has sped up a lot of things that maybe were already problems and were already festering, but have been really put into a glaring relief at this point. And people like the people referenced in this book, people who live in those circumstances in Appalachia or in the Midwest, are going to be affected, significantly more so maybe than the Mitch McConnells and the Rand Pauls of the world.
Hey, Jeff, I'm wondering from your teacher perspective, one recurring obstacle was, I read this somewhere, and so I feel like I'm plagiarizing here, but I could not find where I came across this phrase, but the crippling effect of low expectations.
I can tell you.
I think I got it from a book called The Other Wes Moore, but when I reviewed the book, I couldn't find that quote in there.
Yeah.
It's in this book.
Is it? Well,
okay.
I have it marked. Sorry, Jeff.
No, that's good. I was going to say, because I had an area that I found, like, to me, it kind of speaks towards that, but it's also it was kind of sad for me too, in terms of that was, it's about page 194 and 195. And he kind of talks about that, that idea of, I think he talks about, there's the Pew Economic Mobility Project, and they kind of studied how Americans evaluated their chances at economic betterment. And they said, basically, that there's no group of Americans that are more pessimistic than working class whites. And they said many of African Americans and Latinos and college educated whites expect that their children will fare better economically than they have. But among working class whites, only 44% share that expectation. So I found that really sad that, they kind of almost feel like they're in this perpetual cycle of poverty, and they're no longer seeing that upward mobility is something that's even an option for them. And I just, that was the first time I've seen it. Well, I guess like I said, but to see that in writing and see that number, that percentages made that really, really interesting. I think that's interesting, because I think that's something that, again, where we live is probably, and again, coming from the schooling aspect of where we work, I mean, our whole thing is all about, hey, going, and achieving those dreams, and those, you can do whatever you want, you can be whatever you want. And so I found that to be, like I said, as I read that, it was kind of, it was sad to me, but also it was like, whoa, it's kind of an eye opener. And to see those figures in terms of that percentage, that high number, and I think that's something that, is probably is increasing right now, given the current circumstances, as well as like what Ryan was pointing out, where people are, I think, finally being maybe put face to face with the fact that they are, I may have to ask for help now. And, for a lot of people, that's something that's a tough step to take.
He says when he returns to Middletown, he felt like an outsider. And the quote says, "What turned me into an alien was my optimism," that the neighborhood he was from, and I trust Ryan's judgment on the Midwest. My adventures in the Midwest ended when I was in about 6th or 7th grade. But that seems to be his takeaway from the neighborhood, is his horizons had broadened, and that meant he didn't fit in anymore.
And I can really relate to that statement about not fitting in. A quick story: a couple years ago, I went home for just a visit for the summer, and I spent a really lovely evening with some friends who were having a barbecue, some guys that I had grown up with through elementary and middle and high school, and I was at their house, and every weekend, somebody has a barbecue, and the kids come over and they run around, and the adults drink a beer and talk, or play golf, or whatever they're going to do, and it's something that they do every week all summer long, and it was a really nice thing, and it was not very difficult to imagine that my life could have been part of that. I lived in that town. I even moved back to that town after college for a while. But I also kind of left that evening, and I was sad to some, that I wasn't sharing in some of these kind of communal experiences that they were having. I think about some of the references in the book to there's almost like this, it takes a village, where it's not just your mom and dad, it's your mom, your dad, your grandpa, your cousins.
Mhm.
And I grew up like that quite a bit. And the people in our community did, certainly. And I felt that, but I also knew that just wasn't my place anymore. I had done some different things and made some different choices in my life that had taken me away from there. And that didn't make my choices any better, and it didn't make their choices any worse. It just made them different.
Right.
But that did give me kind of that feeling of isolation in the moment when I'm there visiting, that I can certainly feel. And it's something I've discussed with my friends who have stayed home or have moved back home for various reasons, and they understand that. And I don't think it means necessarily that one of us did something right and one of us did something wrong. It just means the things that we valued for our adulthood at this point were different. And especially for my friends who have kids. So my wife and I don't have kids. And so that changes everything. Being closer to family became more of a priority, or having a more stable job instead of pursuing something riskier. I mean, all these different factors that come into play, I think, really, matter in that Midwestern experience to some extent.
From my teaching experience, and Jeff and I have worked the same career at the same school, same community, most of our careers. But I think, and Jeff, I think you'd agree with this, something that we've learned as teachers and as parents is two essential human needs are to belong and to be valued, to belong to a community and to feel valued. And it seems to me that what Vance was expressing is that hillbilly culture was a place of belonging,
right,
but not of value.
No.
And he even references how much he gets cursed at. Everything's a cussing out. And he kind of thought of it as terms of endearment until later on, when he was reflected on it, said, no, those are not terms of endearment. Those are just cussing outs.
Yeah, I think he said he went to, I don't know if it was like some dinner or whatever, and he was like shocked at how people talk to each other, without yelling and screaming. So,
Yeah, but again, that doesn't mean what he was experiencing wasn't a term of endearment.
True.
It's just later in life he was able to compare it to something different.
Right.
Yes.
And say, well, wait a minute.
Yeah, his frame of
because
reference.
I certainly know sitting down with my wife's family for dinner for the first time was not the same experience as sitting down, with my family or my extended family for the first time. And I don't look back and say, well, that was a bad or good experience, or theirs was the right one. It was just different.
Well, I don't think, if you read this too, and there's you take probably, that mama, I guess is how you would pronounce it, and papa,
mama and papa.
Mama and papa. I mean,
mama.
Mama. I mean, what an amazing character Mama was, but also for someone who you talk about, if she's, the epitome, I guess, of that hillbilly culture, but what a tremendous woman in terms of her perspective on things. I mean, she was light years ahead in terms of some of her views on religion, politics. And like I said, so that was really neat to see as well, that, you don't have to be this Yale educated individual to have that insight and that perspective, and think about where he would be if he hadn't had that influence in his life. And she definitely was not a dainty butterfly. She was call it like you see it, and it was going to tell you to your, I like one of the funniest ones. And again, without getting to, I thought it was really funny. I'm going to just kind of tell you where he was kind of questioning religion. I think, or is it like about page 97? Let me just get the quote, because I won't do it justice, and it's not that great of in terms of, but he was wondering whether he was gay, I think is where it was.
Oh, and yes.
He was questioning where he was gay, and he asks her, and he says, I'm worried that if I'm gay, I'm going to burn in hell. And she basically called him, don't be an effing idiot. How would you know that you're gay? And he explained to her his thought process and where he'd come to do that, and so she just basically turns to him and says, JD, do you want to suck dicks? and he says, no. And she goes, well, then you're not gay. And like I said, it was just, I mean, could you imagine having that conversation with your grandmother? But I just thought, like I said, that what a great character and great figure in his life. And like I said, I thought that was her way. And she had a couple other times like that about
when he's a little older in high school, and she's decided he cannot hang out with the bad kids, because he's going to make something of himself. She tells him, and this resonated with me personally, that if she sees him hanging out with the kids she's decided are not worthy, she will run them over with a car and pretend, and no one's gonna blame her for it. They're just gonna she's just gonna act like I'm an old lady. Oops, and I'll kill your friends. And he doesn't take that as an idle threat or grandma being sarcastic. He's like, oh, she'll kill them, and then she'll go to jail, and I won't even have her. And my dad told us when we were little, if you do drugs, I'll kill you. And we didn't think of that as an idle threat. That was, I would rather be in jail for murdering my child than have a drug user as a kid. And I never once questioned the sincerity in it. I believe that. And that, of course, at the same time, he was a German immigrant, so we were getting beer and wine at the dinner table. So
I was going to
there
say,
was hypocrisy there.
Are you making a statement on this show that you have never done drugs?
I have not.
Okay, there you go. It worked.
I've never even been interested, because if you grow up from the time you're the littlest kid thinking your father will kill you, then it was never a temptation. As friends were doing it, it was never a temptation. And my dad died when I was
parenting style.
Yeah, it was.
I think it was a parenting style that you could definitely get away with back in when we were growing up. But nowadays, I think if you made that comment and the wrong person heard it, or the kid heard it, I mean, who knows what would end up happening?
Well, you think about, my dad died at 17, or when I was 17.
Yeah.
And so the next couple of years, which probably were the biggest temptations, I wanted to be true to his memory, so I wasn't going to screw up then. And by the time I found myself way to college, everybody else had experimented. And I really like beer. Yeah. I picked my poison.
Yeah, who doesn't like beer?
So I don't want to act like I took some moral high road. I was afraid of getting dead, and I really like beer.
That's very good. So
that's a really interesting. It's another commonality we have to some extent is that. But I, for different reasons, I didn't do drugs as a kid, or wasn't really interested in them, not because I wasn't allowed, but because I grew up in kind of a bar culture. My parents owned bars and restaurants. My uncles owned bars and restaurants. And I knew from stories that there wasn't much I could do that would be worse than what my parents had done or my relatives had done. So I thought, well, I'm not rebelling against anything here. I'm not doing anything. I just never was of interest. And then when I started drinking beer, I thought it was always enough. I never felt like I had to take that extra risk, I guess. And, but I also never really thought about it much when friends might have been doing that, other than to say, well, it'd be a lot easier and a lot cheaper if you just buy a 6-pack with me. And,
that was kind of the reasoning.
Being broke had a lot to do with it too. It's probably, I'm sure. I think you could get a 6-pack at my college for, $5 or $6 at the time, and maybe even a 30-pack for $8 or $9 if you were really if you were willing to go to the outskirts of town. And it always seemed much more practical to me.
All right, you two are intellectuals. Let me put you to work on this one. Something back to the book here.
All right.
Poverty and the culture he grows up in, the family he grows up in, the neighbors he grows up, the community in. Poverty is a badge of honor, and yet you somehow get to blame everyone else for it. How does that cognitive dissonance work?
Are you saying that in specific to how he seems to be phrasing it, or
he explained it in that way, and I think he actually used the term badge of honor. That poverty is a badge of honor. Mm-hmm. You don't want help. You don't need help. We're not needy. We're not poor. And he went through several reasons of, we'll spend money on these things to pretend we're not poor while we can't
a large
feed our
screen TV.
And, and at the same time, it's everyone else's fault that I'm not working. That all these issues have come up because we have no money. I'm really interested in that. That's not the ethical or moral compass that I was raised with.
Right.
And I'm puzzled by it.
Well, I think like one of the things I'm not really sure, but to tie into a little bit what Ryan was talking about, because I think he talks about as that being part of it. And I don't think that's just only in the Midwest. I think it's across our country, is people trying to, I don't know if it's keeping up with the Joneses, if you'd say, but everybody has that expectation. I mean, think about when, what was around 2008 when we had the big massive crash, how many people were driving Escalades and all these things that no one could afford it, but you could get a loan for, they'd give you a loan for nothing. And so people were just living on credit, and they kind of talked about it in the book about people like, well, we'll pay for it with our refund check. We're going to have a great Christmas. We don't have any money, but we got to have a really good Christmas for everybody. We're just going to buy all this stuff on layaway credit, whatever else it was. And then we're going to get our refund check in January and we'll pay it all off. And then, wait, our refund check wasn't the amount we wanted this year. So now, and he talked about, people, again, having to, walk away from stuff, this and that and everything else. So I think that's just, that seems to be part of the American, I don't know what it is where we are. It's capitalism. I mean, it's how materialistic we are as a country, where that expectation is, and we constantly are living beyond our means in a lot of ways.
It spins us into this cycle of irrational decision making and self-destruction, it seems like.
And I would think that poverty is a badge of honor if you are still working and providing makes more sense to some extent. The poverty is a badge of honor, but then the blaming of others if things go bad, that feels more like bluster and shame, that to me, at least, and reading it even, you read, there was a segment where he described, driving past an impoverished house in Jackson, Kentucky, and, kids looking out sadly, almost melancholy from inside, and an angry man on the porch who doesn't work, and kind of this whole story about that. And I certainly know that from growing up, what I was taught about working and providing for yourself, and I think the honor is in working hard. If you happen to be impoverished but you're still working hard, there's still honor in that, whether it's a low paying job or a high paying job. The work is the work. That's where the honor is. And the blaming part comes in retrospect, or in when things have gotten beyond your control, and whether it's because you made mistakes with money or the circumstances were stacked against you from the beginning and you just never realized it. I certainly know that. I keep saying that. That's a terrible phrase. I got to fall out of that. I certainly know. Of course I know it. I'm the one saying it.
In my opinion, I certainly know that I feel.
That I feel a certain way. But my wife and I, about, 12, 13 years ago, up until that point, we had always, Christmas was a big deal, and birthdays, and we'd buy each other gifts, and we'd go home for the holidays and we would buy gifts for my brothers and her family and my parents. But we couldn't afford them. We were college kids or right out of college, and we had student loans, and we had, expenses, and we really couldn't afford them. And it finally got to a breaking point where we had to have a sit down, and we said to our families, like, hey, this isn't reasonable for us. I know it's tradition. We always buy each other gifts. We just can't get ahead if we keep doing this. And that was something that I'm not sure a lot of people go through. They either just keep pushing forward, and then, they end up getting better jobs and they're able to catch up. But if we wouldn't have made that decision where we just said, we're going to cut it off, we don't need anything from you as a gift. There's no obligation here, but we're also not coming to the party with gifts either. We just can't. And there was some hurt feelings that first year, because it had been tradition and we had all done that. But after a year, after 2 years, it kind of became more of it was just accepted. And if you brought a gift, it was because you wanted to do it and there was no obligation in return. And it's made our lives much richer, and also made it much more reasonable for us to get ahead on things like student loans, and kind of set a tone for us later in life when we really committed to trying to get ahead financially. And by get ahead, I mean, break even, which is ultimately the goal. But I can see where people that are in a position, they don't want to admit that they're poor. And so it's almost like you're a kid bragging on the schoolyard, and that never goes away.
Right.
How can I be poor? I have a huge television set.
Right.
The poor person couldn't afford that. If you're the kid who wears the same shirt or same pair of pants to school every day and someone's making fun of you, it's kind of that schoolyard attitude brought into adulthood. It's an emotional immaturity. Yeah.
So you imagine if you're in J.D. Vance's family, the way he described them, you got a little grief, little hardship from family about your decision, your wife's decision, your decision, and imagine the verbal beating
Yep.
he would have taken. I found the quote that's exactly what we're talking about. I dog-eared this page 148. Not all the white working class struggles. I knew even as a child that there were two separate sets of mores and social pressures. My grandparents embodied one type, old-fashioned, quietly faithful, self-reliant, hardworking. My mother, and increasingly the entire neighborhood, embodied another, consumerist, isolated, angry, distrustful.
And I think he draws. One of the things I took out of that is he really draws almost a line between generations, and that generation of his grandparents was what you would say that the poor that had that badge of honor. They worked hard. They didn't have a lot, but they paid their bills. They lived, debt free, if you want to say, or whatever. They had a house. They provided for their. Whereas the generation of his parents or his mom, and then even I guess in somewhat his older siblings and that kind of stuff was more of this generation that is more into the consumerism. I think he talks about the one example. I can't remember. I was trying to find it. I couldn't find it, but it was the one where the guy has a pregnant wife, needs to get a job, but he goes and he decides like after a day or two, it's constantly blaming like, oh, the boss doesn't like me, or this doesn't work, or this.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all the reasons why he wouldn't go work. And he and JD in there's talking about he couldn't understand this because here he has to provide not only for himself, but he's got a wife with a kid on the way and all this kind of stuff. But he was finding every reason not to work, making excuse and blaming. And I thought that was kind of interesting because a lot of it to me kind of divided or separated along generational lines, or at least that's what he was saying within his community. That's what he was seeing,
But he doesn't acknowledge that the rules have changed on a larger political scale and economic scale from 2-3 generations ago to now.
Yeah.
The idea of credit didn't exist then. The inflation things that didn't exist then. Right. Minimum wage was more applicable to a living wage as opposed to now where we've had the same minimum wages in some state. Georgia's minimum wage is still $7.25.
Right.
Imagine trying to live in a community with rising, rental rates or housing rates on that salary. And right. I think that's where some of this gets turned around is this attitude of like, well, my grandparents were able to do it. I was able to do it. Why can't you do it?
Right.
That he seems to be projecting on a population of people in that area, but they're not playing by the same rules of the game that those generations were playing.
Because if you think about Mama's living in the house that was purchased
right
with union wages, and she has lived many years on her husband's union pension. Right.
Sure. And when my dad went to get a loan to start a business, he went to the bank and said, "Hey, I need a loan," and they gave him the money. And then when that business burned to the ground 6 months later and he had forgotten insurance, they just gave him the money again. Could you imagine that happening now? That's 1981 in the small community, but people would maybe, especially in a smaller community where people knew you, he was able to do that based on his reputation as somebody who worked hard and who was to be trusted, as opposed to, someone now going to get a business loan. It's not the same situation. And so you mentioned earlier, Jeff, number one, about low expectations and how that might impact you or impact a community. And when I was thinking about that, it led me to this idea of representation. And one thing that seemed to be, he seemed to want to kind of, he seemed to be going in a different path than, say, his family ancestors had or his relatives to some extent. And he was trying to figure out, well, maybe this is the wrong path because it's not what they had done. He didn't have that role model that had gone this different direction in his immediate life. And I think about, we talk about now in our current political environment and having representation of different races and genders and all these things in Joe Biden's cabinet. That's a big issue. There was no representation in the current administration's cabinet.
Right.
And there's a push to have, it's already the most diverse cabinet coming in that will ever be in history, but a push even more, because those representative moments are important to the kids coming up now. I interviewed a local councilwoman, councilperson Priya Patel recently, and she had mentioned that when she was younger, she didn't have an Indian American woman that she could look to at any point that had done things politically. And so when she came out of college, that wasn't something that was on her radar. It wasn't an option, she didn't think. And it was only through meeting with other people who had been successful that she thought, oh, well, I can do this. Like, this is important to me. And in my hometown, actually, a woman, Katie Rosenberg, was just elected mayor. She's the first female mayor. And her biggest fan is a friend of hers' daughter, who's like 5 or 6 years old. And she's always got, vote for Katie signs. And she was very proactive and Katie's her hero. And then when the younger girl saw Vice President-elect Kamala Harris on stage, she asked her parents, what is she doing up there? Because she didn't know that women could be in that position. But she'll grow up her whole life knowing that now, which makes the trajectory of her life different. And so that's a really interesting thing. And you wonder if in these communities with kind of massive, with a lot of oppression or a lot of poverty, if part of that is because they don't have that immediate person to look to and say, well, they did it,
right,
I can do it. And then if they start doing something good, the people around them go, well, what are you doing? No one does it like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I do think that's, well, first of all, did Priya mention she did have an amazing English teacher
and Spanish teacher? Yes.
I don't know if she mentioned that in the conversation. I listened to the interview and I thought maybe it was on the
it was probably
room floor.
Yeah, there wasn't enough to
spend. I didn't edit it out.
Okay. All right. You
sorry,
do what
guys.
we do, and we do, and we do for these kids.
Your job is
the things we get.
It's
on that
unsung
idea
heroes.
That representation, this is something that Jeff and I actually spoke about on the weekend when we realized we need to stop talking about the book because we need to save it for the podcast. But that representation, which we know as teachers, is crucial. And we know how many of our students don't get to have a teacher that looks like them, that comes from the same cultural group of them or speaks the same home language as them. We're very aware of that. But there's also what I might consider the illusion of representation. And this book really opened that up to me, that, John Kennedy from Louisiana, Ted Cruz from Texas, Donald Trump might be the most obvious one right now, but these people that speak hillbilly, they're not representations. These are, Kennedy and Cruz are Ivy League educated lawyers, but they speak, and you see, and Rand Paul would be another example. Mitch McConnell is another example where you see they don't have this community's interests in mind that I can tell. And then they say crazy stuff, and you wonder, why did they say the crazy stuff? And this book helped me realize it's the illusion of representation. They're speaking hillbilly. And
sure.
I still am uncomfortable with that term, but since you seem perfectly okay with it and Vance is okay with it, I'm using it. That there's this illusion of representation, that they're not outsiders. They get us. They're with us.
Maybe I should be more uncomfortable with the term. It just never was something I had thought about before, reading this book as a negative. And I think going from it just was not something that I thought of on the same level as a slur. And maybe that's something, it's always about what you're aware of and what you've been educated in. This book made it seem like a badge of honor to him.
Yes.
Like he really, despite his successes in life, he really feels like the heroes are his uncles who are still
right,
back there, or probably are gone at this point. It really was confusing to me. Not confusing, because I understand why it might be for a kid to look up to, the uncles and who created the stories of your youth. What was surprising to me was that as he got older, he didn't maybe add context to those stories as his life expanded out into the world. As he joined the Marines and had gone out and traveled, as he went to to college in Ohio and then later at Yale. He doesn't seem to look back at those stories and apply context of what was happening outside of Appalachia, politically or economically or in war, to that area that maybe some of those stories could have been different had the circumstance been different.
He says something that makes me really nervous at the end that I'm flipping to it because you made me think of it, where I'm starting to get on his side and he's really starting to convince me. And I did really appreciate that he explained that the problems that culture faces are not unique to that culture. There's a lot of different communities that have a pride that also is a double-edged sword. But almost at the very end, he says, these problems were not created by governments or corporations or anyone else. We created them, and only we can fix them. And that seemed to me I actually wrote my book, Uh-oh. That really seemed to me right back to that stubborn pride that's not going to allow improvements.
I'm going to vote for a 30-second beer break, but before I'm going to say what I wrote at that exact same point was, this guy is a douche. And then I wrote his conservative kind of bootstrappy trope. It seems to design to say, hey, look over here while and while you're distracted, I'm going to pass some laws and some other things over here that keep you looking over there.
Right.
I really felt that you said it much more eloquently, but that was what my uh-oh meant.
Was that the douche part was the more eloquent?
Yeah. It felt like he was encouraging people who were in need to reject that help, embrace that pride, and kind of accept the consequences of their personal failures without examining those circumstances that are outside of their control.
You can do it yourself, even though he did not do it himself.
Exactly. And
and that's a beautiful part of his story, that he didn't do it himself.
Right.
That the Marine Corps was there, that Mama was there, that he had professors.
Yeah, he wouldn't have made it. He wouldn't have made it without that. I mean,
and even admittedly without his current wife, because it sounds,
she's another one.
Current wife. Ouch, you better take a beer break on that one.
I meant current meaning like
his wife.
Yeah, right now. His wife. Yeah. I'll be right back.
Yeah, no worries.
Current wife. That just sounds imminent danger.
I like to think of my wife as my current wife because she could choose to end it at any time.
That's a good point.
And I need to keep that in mind. So
it's not getting better. Stop. There's no way out of this one. It's like a bad Steven Seagal movie. Nowhere to run.
Yeah.
Oh, well, how was that beer?
I really like it. And it's as it warms up, it gets really, really even better.
I had that with our book with Mr. Hankus, Nate Hankus.
Yeah.
The Appalachian Trail book.
Right.
We keep returning to the Appalachians.
We do keep returning to the Appalachian.
And there are plenty of Appalachian good old boys in the baseball book we read with our book club.
That is true as well.
Nate's book, Appalachian Trail, was recently selected as one of the top books by Progressive Magazine.
Nice. That's cool.
Yeah.
You should shout that out at the end.
Yeah, you know what? I've got to tie into that too.
All right, before we sign off on that, talk about that. You can talk a little bit about how we seem to keep coming back to Appalachia.
Yeah.
Well,
I had a different tie-in, but you do that part.
No, it's good. Because actually one of the things I was going to say that was that, like, after having read it, I think I talked about it a little bit when we were talking about him this weekend, is that after I read this book, I got into reading a bunch of books about kind of the Midwest and that kind of stuff, but a lot of it was all around the opioid epidemic, or that issue and that problem. And so I remember in my I originally thought there was much more of that in here, and I think that's what's an interesting thing here, because where he's talking about in terms of Middletown and any of those areas, and those places have gotten just hammered by by the opioids and those issues in terms of the amount of people, that's not even touched on in here at all, as far as what a huge issue and problem that has become throughout the Midwest, West Virginia as well, all of those areas. And I think that actually ties into.
it's not. That's fine.
Yeah. So, but so it's just kind of interesting that
Half hour.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. My wife is making a pie. She wanted to know if she could use the mixer.
Yeah.
We'll tie up here in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah, we'll be
because I don't want to hold back pie.
Yes,
I do. I will not be a party to
priorities.
missing out on pie.
Yeah.
I didn't get any of the last 2 pies, so don't feel
okay.
Oh man.
So Jeff, do you want to just kind of bring it back in on that what you had talked about before, and then Joe could?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to bring it back toward the end of the book to something Ryan had pointed out that was his main gripe. So I'm going to tie it back to there. So I'm going to go in 3, 2.
Okay.
So Ryan, I do agree, and it was a note I took in that last 20% of the book, sort of like we saw from Nate Hinkes, and he was very aware of it. He was worried that his book he used the word, not me, I'm not intellectual like him. He used the word didactic. And I feel like that's what Vance does toward the end of the book. He starts getting a little too, I don't want to say political and I don't want to say preachy, but he starts telling me what to think instead of sharing the story and letting me think. And I think that's something you picked up on right away.
I think
thought
I
in
picked
Nate's
up
book
on
it
it.
worked.
Yeah, and Nate is very aware of it, and I think he's very aware. He's trying to present his ideas as his ideas, but also leave room for you to have your own opinions and for you to apply your own way of thinking to what he thinks. And where Vance kind of seems to come off as saying, well, this is what I think, and it's probably right because I went to Yale.
Yes.
And which, I don't know, I think is kind of a joke. I mean, I think the story is like, well, if they went to Yale, then obviously they're smarter than the rest of us. That's not a joke that I made up. I think I saw that with Natalie Portman joking about her own education. With this book, as irritated as I may sound now, I didn't necessarily read it through it the whole time being like, well, this guy's an asshole. Excuse my language. I read it identifying with parts, commiserating or empathizing, sympathizing. And it was only, as you just mentioned, kind of in that last 20%, that last third, that I thought, well, come on, like this is getting a little bit off the rails. I'm no longer thinking anymore. I'm just listening.
Yes.
But I thought there were warnings in the beginning, even in the introduction, where he says he doesn't identify with the WASPs of the Northeast. He's different from them. He doesn't identify with that. And okay, well, there's a lot of people that don't identify with
Right.
that. Why is that the identifying trait? Or he said, to understand me, you must understand that I'm a Scots-Irish hillbilly at heart. But he's kind of setting the tone that I am this from Appalachia, this hillbilly, when we've already established that he clearly isn't. And that was more his ancestry and his heritage than his actual existence. And I actually wrote in the notes, I was like, okay, he could be a leprechaun at heart. Like, it doesn't make a difference. And there was one particular comment where he kind of specifically requests that you as the reader read without filtering the views of this book through a racial prism, as if race doesn't have any sort of impact in the way you grow up, or in America, the circumstance that you grew up in. And for him, as a child of the 80s and early 90s, as I was, one of the great awakenings that kind of our country is having now is that, even in what we would consider kind of this more modern age where everybody was, I grew up thinking everyone was equal. That's not necessarily true because of all these extenuating circumstances and the history that led up to that point. And so to say, to be upfront, when I remember reading it and thinking, well, that's an odd thing to say. Why would that be the thing that is he saying there are no people of different races in these communities? Are, poor people in different communities not as relevant to this book? And it felt like he was really trying to narrow the focus down so he could avoid criticism on some of these things.
Where I think the whiteness of the culture he's talking about is crucial to understanding the culture. Yeah, like Jeff said at the beginning, that when you look at statistically, Black families, Latino families that have these high expectations, there's, all the way back to Pap Finn and Huckleberry Finn, where Huck gets a beating because he's learned how to read, and his father says, "Don't you dare be better than me." That seems to be part of the white hillbilly heritage, is the not only low expectation, but you're not allowed to rise above me because we're proud of who we are. You're betraying who we are. Seems to be part of that hillbilly white culture. And Vance talks about it more than once without talking about race. But
I think that's what he's trying to say, but by saying it's not about race, he kind of brings that back into play. And as you just said, it's about that white hillbilly culture that feels that way. So race is a factor. But he also talks about people in that same community that don't have that attitude, like his grandparents who moved. And so it's tough for me to say that's necessarily something that is a point of pride. That feels as for an entire culture of people. He lists quite a few examples of people who grew up in similar circumstances who made changes in their life.
Mm-hmm.
But then he focuses in on a few that he sees anecdotally in his travels home or his travels to visit family that seem to represent what he calls an entire swath of people, as opposed to saying an entire swath of people can represent themselves. Instead, he focuses in on one example.
Yeah,
says, well, that example is appropriate.
That's where I'm so tangled up. It almost seems like a stubborn ignorance that no one can help us but ourselves. But I needed help, and I'm going to list people where outsiders came in, whether it was through their education or through the military or through luck and fate and the stars combining to give opportunities. And so he makes a claim rather boldly at the end that the government can't solve any of these cultural problems. And he has a list of reasons why. And I'm guessing from our conversation, we're not buying it completely. I think there's some truth in it. It's hard to help people. What do they say in airplane? Yeah. Chump don't want no help. Chump don't get no help.
It's hard to help people that don't want to be helped. Right.
But I don't think he's entirely right.
Yeah.
Well, what you're avoiding there is you don't have to make things worse either.
Right.
You don't have to stack the deck against them either. If you're playing 21, you're not putting, all the face cards at the top of the deck for someone to kick out on. So, just because, America was started by these kind of aggrandizing, rebellious upstarts. I don't think self-aggrandizing, maybe past future generations aggrandize them. But that doesn't mean everyone started with an equal playing field either. And it kind of feels like what he's saying is that everyone did start with an equal playing field. And even those of us that didn't, we can get out without your help. And I did it. So if you can't do it, then you're worse than me. And it almost feels like he's trying to prop himself up there. But I think I agree that there's truth in that you can't help people that maybe don't want help. But I do think it's important to note that from a political or an economic standpoint, you don't have to put them further behind either.
True.
And I think you referenced earlier, you can find people in that same community that will accept the help. Let them be the role models for the next generation. Right. Give some glimmer of hope. And I guess in some ways, J.D. Vance plays that role for people in his hometown that say, right. He made it. That teacher that I have in the same high school helped him.
Yeah.
That counselor that guided him.
There was a thing he talked about and called the brain drain. And basically it's, where people, once they are, they get out of a certain community and they get their education, everything else, they don't go back. And so all of your, like you said, those potential role models, those people that have the education, everything else, don't come back and give back basically to that community or be that role model. So it sounds like he's at least trying to fill that role a little bit, and hopefully as you get more to do that, because I think that's, as you talked about, having that representation, that's extremely important for people to see, examples of success or examples of pathways out, because I think for anything without that, it does become really tough, and it's really tough to do on your own.
Sure, but he didn't actually move back to be that example. He
No,
lives in a college town in Columbus,
true.
Ohio.
He's in. Yeah, I think yes.
Well, you got to pick
Yeah.
your
But he
side of the
did.
road you're on, Ryan. You
did
also said he
purchase-
didn't move that far away.
Yeah, he did. He did.
I agree. He went back to where he came from. I'm just
Right.
clarifying that it's not Hillbilly Appalachia.
He's not living. Yes, in the town of where he
right.
where he grew up. I would say that. But that is extremely important, and I think another area when you talked about that poverty and that upward mobility, just to kind of come back into it too, as you said, is that and people starting off on an even playing field. I think it was really interesting too. There was a part in there where they talked about that in these towns, say in the 50s, where you had factories and everybody had jobs, union jobs and all that kind of stuff. Well, when the factories all left, the people that were well-to-do all left as well. And now you have this population
because they can afford to,
and then those that were maybe that were workers, the manufacturers, that kind of stuff, are stuck now because there isn't a place for them to get that job. They don't have that opportunity. And I think that's where it is going to be impossible for communities like that to do it all on their own. Whether you have to come in and kind of change and I think we've seen these examples all over the United States where towns were built on manufacturing, built on that, and they've changed themselves into making themselves more about tech and modernizing that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden now you have jobs come back as well.
Well, that's the part that just baffles me about the politicians that have learned to speak hillbilly.
True.
That will tell them what they want to hear.
Right.
And it's believed, and it certainly is not just limited to this culture.
No.
And then they'll buy it, even though on the ground, boots on the ground don't see any difference.
Yeah.
Or logic flies in the face of it. And
right.
Reality flies in the face of it.
I would say it is a prime example of that is the whole coal industry, right? Even the people that work in the coal industry will tell you it is going away and we need to do some changes. But I mean, hey, we're still propping it up and, planning on it growing and going forward. So
that really applies to where I grew up in Wisconsin and neighboring states. And in making decisions after those jobs left away, after manufacturing jobs left, say the suburbs of Milwaukee, they responded by doubling down on blue-collar manufacturing job efforts. Whereas when those jobs left Minneapolis, St. Paul area, they doubled down on technology and science and education. And it's kind of a tale of it's really interesting if you want to do some fun Googling. Google kind of the economic histories of Wisconsin and Minnesota over the past 25 years, and you'll see a pretty dramatic break there.
Yeah.
But you were mentioning about you don't understand with the politicians. 4 years ago, Wisconsin went for Trump, and part of that was because of a lot of manufacturing and blue-collar work promises that he made, which now 4 years later, Wisconsin went for Biden. And I actually think that's hopeful because those promises didn't come to fruition. They actually made things worse. Those thousands of jobs turned into a loss of jobs. And whereas I think one of the concerns that this book has is that they'll keep repeating their same mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people in Wisconsin saw what was happening and changed. They decided to vote differently. I mean, the vote swung more than 20, 30 some thousand votes overall from red to blue. And so they made a choice based in part on learning that this didn't work this time around. Right. And I think one of J.D. Vance's very accurate fears is that people in communities that are struggling will continue to make the same choices for whatever reason that put them in
mostly.
That they're seeing the example of their role models is to make these mistakes, and they're continuing that mistake of
admitting
thinking
they're wrong. Or I guess I grew up in a family where I was reminded I was wrong often, so admitting I was wrong didn't seem so hard. But apparently that's a real cultural thing for multiple cultures. But Vance makes it clear with this culture, admitting you're wrong outside of the family unit, not easzy.
See, I was the oldest brother, so I was never wrong.
Nice.
Unless my dad was around, and then I was wrong.
Well, Jeff, I appreciate you bringing Hillbilly Elegy to the game. I had some issues with the narration, especially in that last 20% that Ryan has elevated now to. I have a bigger issue with them now. They didn't really hit me to the last end of the book. I did very much appreciate this look into a culture that I don't understand, that I've been puzzled by. and having a much better understanding of it now. So thank you for the book choice.
Yeah.
We kind of brought it up before I think we got on the air here, but are we watching the movie?
That's a great question. It's interesting because I haven't watched the movie yet, but I've read a lot of the stuff about it, and I think people are really divided on it in terms of whether they like it, and actually most of the people that are from that area don't like it. Yeah. So that's the part that I find the most interesting. So I think at some point I probably will break down and watch it, but I'm always hesitant when I hear a lot of people not like something to just immediately kind of watch it, and especially when it's people that are, in theory, this is about them,
I love movies, so I am definitely going to watch this movie. In fact, I kept thinking of what was the 3 Billboards?
Oh, yes, and that was a great movie. 3 Billboards in something, was it Montana or Missouri?
Yeah, 3 Billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri.
Ebbing, Missouri, yeah. What's her name was in that? Frances McDermott?
I kept thinking of Sam Rockwell's character.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he was great. Yes, no, perfect. Yes, he would be a great actor in this movie.
So I have not watched the movie. I think in the past I might have been more inclined to jump on it and watch it, especially if it was a book I had read, just so I could say the book was better, which is a little pretentious of me. But I have found during, 8 months into COVID that I lean more towards movies that I don't have to have an emotional response to, because I'm having so many emotional responses just in my day-to-day life. And so I think it might be one of those movies that a few years from now I'm going to see on Netflix or on Amazon or something and go, you know what? I always wanted to watch that.
Yeah.
And I'll watch it then when this is behind us.
You have some space.
That might be a good call.
Yeah. I do like Amy Adams, though. I trust her as an actress.
I don't know if we've entirely solved the cultural, socioeconomic, educational gaps that exist in America, but I think we've come pretty close. And if not, isn't it pretty to think so?
Yes.
Yes, it is. Maybe we should send this to the Yale archives just for
there you go.
So thank you for taking an hour to listen to us talk about a book and drink a beer. This has been I Like Beer, the Book Club. Jeff Spanier, Jeff Riccitelli, and Ryan Woldt. And Ryan's got another one. He's got more.
We can't go yet.
Okay.
I wanted to shout out one of our previous books, Waking Up on the Appalachian Trail by N.B. Hankis. I'm not sure why the N.B. is Nate Hankis. His book was just called out as one of the favorites of 2020 by Progressive Magazine. And so that's kind of cool that we were on that before anyone else.
Yeah, we were.
Congratulations.
Yes. Congratulations to Nate and congratulations to us for being, the foresight to already have read and broken down that book.
3 book club meetings.
And we get to call him Nate. We get to call him Nate because he's a personal friend, because he was on the show.
That's right.
But to you listeners, he's N.B. Hankis.
That's right. And you can get his book at nbhankis.com. It's a really worthy read.
Yes, it's another. Yeah.
I might pick it up again after. Now I'm drinking a beer from Society, and so I feel more intellectual than I did at the start of this conversation.
And I'm on empty, so I think it's time to go. So thanks again. Ryan, you're up next for picking a book.
What, really?
Yep. But good night. Thank you for taking the time to listen and talk about a book with us. Cheers.
Cheers.